In this video, I want to solve a problem where you have a CSV file and maybe that file doesn't always have the same amount of columns. This can be a case in SAP where you use someone's variant where maybe they change it in the future to get more columns or fewer columns, but you don't really care because it has all of the columns you need. But you need to make sure that if they add columns, you also add those, and if they remove columns, you also remove those. I'm going to use a simple CSV which has two errors, which is right here. I have a missing column header, and here I have a missing value. And this is going to be relevant much later, but I just want to showcase it. To start, I just need to grab data from a CSV and then transform it. And it immediately wants to promote headers, which I don't want to do yet. And in this first part, I actually only want the first row because what I want to do is to figure out, well, what is my last column here with data? And I'm going to assume that in the first row you have the headers, and you shouldn't have a problem like here where you're actually missing the name of a column, because what I want to do, initially at least, is to increase the amount of columns I have to something like 20, and then it's going to do that again. Because in this initial solution, I want to make sure that even if the person adds more columns in the future, I always have those columns. So if I have 15 columns, now they can add a maximum of 5, and you could make this even bigger. It's not like that changes anything, but this is what it's going to be at the beginning. And then later on, I'll convert it into a function. So you can make this not exactly hard-coded because it's a function that's variable, but so that you don't have to do anything here. Like I said, I only actually need the first row. So I can say I want the table.firstEnd function to grab only that first row. And the initial idea I had was that it's annoying to have 25 columns because then I need to scroll to find the last value. So I'll change this to 20. My initial idea was that in order to find the last column with data in it, which in this case is column 15, I could use the coalesce operator, the double question marks, to say, if this value is different from null, then I want to grab the column header, or actually the index position. And if this is null, then go to the next column and keep going until you find column 15 here, which has a value. But if I do that, we can see why that won't work. So I want to grab the value in column 20, unless this is a null, in which case I want to grab 15. The problem is that this null coalescence function actually checks if the value is null, and this value isn't null, it's a blank text string, because if it was null, it would say null right here. So this won't work. I could do something like if column 20 is equal to a blank text string, or if column 20 is equal to null, now it's being annoying, it's equal to null. And actually I should do it like this: if it's different from an empty text string and it's different from null, then I want to print column 20, otherwise I want to grab column 15. So in this case, column 20 is an empty text string, so I get 15. But in any case, it won't work. What I want to do instead is that I can convert this one row table into a one column table, and then I can add index positions, which will be relevant in a moment. So if I start out doing transpose, if I can find that, transpose, I don't want to use the table, can't use coalesce, I want to use the first row table. And as we see here, I have an empty row, as I explained before, which means that if I simply apply a filter here to say I don't want blanks, then it will also remove that E column. And I do want that E column because the idea is that, well, I know that I actually have 15 columns with data, because if I kept that E in, my O column would be in row 15, so I need to grab 15 columns. But because I removed the empty rows, this messes up my count. So what I can do is, before I add my filter, I want to add a new column with my indexes. I want to start from 1 because I know that I have 15 columns, because I have 15 here. So now when I remove all of the empty rows, it doesn't matter that I remove the E, because what I need is the index position for the last column that isn't blank. And then what I need is to grab the last row, because that's how I get this 15. So the easiest way is to just change the sort order. And then I can say, and then I want to grab the first row, so index position 0. And then I want to grab the value inside of the index column. This query now outputs a number, which I can use in my source step as my columns argument. But I first want to show that maybe I wanted to do this in one query and then have another query where I use the output of this query in its source. Meaning I want to copy this step and say this is my first step, but then instead of the columns 20 argument, I want to use the output of simple CSV. And this is going to give me a formula firewall error, because I'm not allowed to reference another query inside of my source step for safety reasons. I could do it like this, where I have both the calculation for my last column inside of the step where I output my query. This is going to get very messy, but I could do it. So like this, and then I change the last column index to be my column argument, and then it's going to be happy. This is disgusting to look at, but it would work. We can see here what happens if you promote headers and you don't actually have a column name. It stretches it out like so. But I think it's ugly and hard to understand when you have all of these steps in the query, and right after you use the output of this step in my source step, so this would be source 2. I'd rather have one query that outputs this number, and then I use that in my source, but I'm not allowed to do that. What I can do instead is to take this query, the first steps at least, these steps, and convert them into a function, which I then use in my source step in another query. The trouble is, my input parameter is going to be a table, which means I can't just convert this query into a function. Well, I can do that, but my input is going to be a table, which, as I showed in the most recent video, it's going to be a problem when you want to manually write functions. It's hard to troubleshoot, but I'm going to do it anyway. I want to go into Advanced Editor and copy that, and then manually create the function. Then I want my first step to be everything I got from Advanced Editor, and then I need to convert this into a function. I want my function to have two arguments, my table, which is type table, and my row as a number. And this is going to be relevant because, as I showed in my CSV here, I have that missing column name here. And at the end of this first row, the data row, I need a value at the end here. And I'm going to show that this would provide a problem. You should be able to grab the number of columns from the first row because that's the column headers, but I just want to be thorough. And then my output should be a number, and that goes towards. And then this isn't proper syntax yet, but this is just a start. My first step is something I need to add, which is that I want to grab my row index in my table, and this will make sense in a moment when I actually get to show it. This should be able to table from records, because I'm going to access a record inside of my table, and that record, meaning the row, is going to be the my row argument. And the table.fromRecords takes records as a list, so I need to wrap this in curly brackets. Then I can say my table, and I want to access the row called my row. And this is instead of the source, because I don't want to hardcode the actual source. This should be relative to whatever I have in my query, so that the code in this function is something I can copy paste. So I want to remove this source step. And then I no longer need this first row step because I'm accessing the X row. And this step didn't work anyway, so I can remove that. Meaning in my transpose table step, I'm not referring to the first row step, I'm referring to the X row step. And then I still add the index, which is then referring to the transpose table step. And then this should actually be fine. So if I copy paste this query, because I still want this first step, and I can put these two in a group. If I then try out the function, first to check that it actually works, and then I can deal with showing what I want to show, which is why I need that argument of my row. I want to grab 0th index, which is the first row, which gives 15, so that's what I want. Now I can show what I wanted to show, which is why I wanted to include that my row argument. And this is because I want this function to be robust. So in the future, maybe you don't want to check the first row, which has the headers. Maybe you want to check a data row. Not that this should be relevant, but I just want to be thorough. So this is my 0th row, i.e. the headers. And then I also want the first row with data, meaning the first row. And then I forgot that this is a record, which means I need to give them a name. So row 0 is equal to this function, and row 1 is equal to this function. So what I see here is that row 0 gives 15 and row 1 gives 14. And if I go back here to show it, I can say here, I don't want the first row. I actually want the second row, which I don't remember if I can do it like this. Actually, I think there should be a last row, last n. Yeah, so last n1. Just to show why I get these two different values. Here I get 15 and 14. So if I step through the actual query, that is basically the function, I can see that the problem is that when I transpose here in my 15th row, I don't actually have a value. I do have the comma, but then I don't have anything in the row. So no value, which means when I filter, I'm removing that row, and that's why I end up getting 14. So this might happen if you have a column where, let's say you have a shipping date and a received date. So maybe your data table is most recent shippings first, and you've shipped a package, but it hasn't arrived yet, meaning the arrival date is empty, which means there's no data, which means it gets filtered out by this function. And that's why I wanted to include this. And then I want this to be first in just to be thorough. And again, I don't think this should actually be necessary to do, but maybe you have some strange situation where you need this, and that's why I want to do it. So what I can then do is I want to find the maximum of my tester rows. So you could have multiple rows that you test in order to find the correct amount of columns. So I want to say, I want to use list max upon this table. Well, actually it's a record, which means I have to convert the record into a list. So the simplest way to do that is to access the first row, so row 0, and then I also want row 1, and then I need to wrap that in actual list parentheses, so this gives me 15. And now I can go into my source step and say that instead of typing in 20 columns, I can use the output of this step in order to determine how many columns to use. And to make it a bit easier, I want to add some line breaks. So now this is fine, and this is doing what I expected to. And now I can raise headers, which is what PowerQuery wants to do. The only trouble then is that this change type step manually refers to the columns. So if I were to go in and delete one of the columns or change the name, so I make this P and then save it and then update, then this is going to give an error because it's specifically referring to the O column. And then I do believe there's an extra argument here. At least I think so. So this is just me testing things. I think you can say in this function that you can ignore any errors. Or maybe I'm wrong. My idea was I could add the missing field ignore to my function transform column types, but ignoring empty isn't exactly a culture, so that's not allowed. I figured I could do that, because you should be able to use that function, but I guess there aren't a lot of functions that allow this missing field type. Because checking out powerquery.how, I can see that there are only these functions that use it, so I can do it for table transform columns, but I guess I can't use it for transform column types. Yeah, because the function specifies this optional missing field, which isn't an argument in transform column types. That's just me wanting more out of PowerQuery than it has, I guess. Meaning you still need a way to solve types, which I can't exactly do here, but it might not be a problem because if whoever makes the variant in SAP, if they add more columns, well, maybe you delete those columns. So as long as you can refer to the columns that you want by name and then delete any extra columns, then it's not a problem in the change type step, because you make sure to say, I only want these columns, and then remove the others. And then the change type step gets mad, of course, because there are a lot of columns it can't find. But then I can say, can never remember where that is. Yeah, under detect data type, it'll just add it itself. So this solution will only decide how many columns to include from the CSV. It can also solve the problem of getting too many columns, because I assume you want to include them all, and then you need to deal with the ones you don't want, which you then have to remove and then deal with typing. So, yep,